Services Marketing, MKT 625, Lecture number 13.
Assalamu alaikum Khawateen Hazrat. Waseem Hassan welcomes you to lecture number 13 of Services Marketing MKT 625 at the Virtual University of Pakistan. Managing expectations was a topic in the previous lecture, and we continue with the same. As with many other things in services marketing, managing expectations also has to be viewed in relation to the three phases of the purchasing process, meaning the pre-purchase phase and the encounter phase and the post-purchase phase. In the previous lecture, I talked about the first two phases, meaning the pre-purchase and the encounters. For the sake of consistency, let me give you a very brief recap of those two phases, because that is going to facilitate our understanding while I talk about the remaining last phase and also the impact of the overall concept onto satisfaction. The pre-purchase phase is all about establishing expectations very accurately on part of the customers. And with what I told you was, people who are the front line people, meaning the sales people and the operations people, could be very helpful while they establish what exactly is it that customers expect. Getting to the bottom of the expectations is extremely significant, because that is something which is going to minimize any possible gap. And we can do that only if we have positioned the product accurately. The second element of this phase is about being very accurate in talking with the consumer. The meaning, our communication has got to be very explicit. The communication should not be overdone and it should not be underdone. And I did talk about the explicit messages and the implicit messages. And when I talk about explicit messages, I'm talking, you see, in very technical terms that, reflect advertising and word of mouth communications by sales and operations people. And it also reflects the physical evidence, because so many different signals stem from the physical evidence, which is full of tangibles. Even the staff uniforms, I told you, you will recall, do send certain signals. And therefore, everything has got to be very much in line with the positioning of the service product. So explicit messages as well as implicit messages have got to fall very much in line with the expectations which you have accurately established. And the third element, which again is very important, is about consistency. The reason that I'm rubbing in these three elements is that you will see that when I talk about the satisfaction side of the customer, these elements are going to present themselves even more convincingly. Consistency is something which really adds to the experiential side of your existing customers. If you are consistent, it means you are delivering the service according to the quality which is envisaged and which is part of the technical side of the service, meaning your product is falling beautifully on the technical merits. And consistency also is something which gives your company the reputation of being very reliable. And reliability, which you will see later, is one of the most important dimensions which consumers view while they evaluate quality of a service. So given these three elements, we are done with the first phase of the purchasing process, and that brings us to the second phase, which is encounters. And encounters, you will recall, are by themselves the variables of change. It is during encounters that service providers could have the luxury of modifying their behavior. So it is all about modifications if need be. Modifications can be of two different kinds. One is on part of the customer, which not really is the topic right here, because customers make modifications to their behavior in response to so many different situations, and that falls in the ambit of the predicted level of expectation. We are here concerned about modifications which are carried out by the providers in order to be efficient and effective while they are having an encounter with their customers. Modifications can take place either by way of offering something extra, meaning some extra facilitation or by way of expressing inability on part of the provider. Let me talk about these two one by one, and I think I did not really talk about this in the previous lecture. Offering something extra can be exemplified by a situation in which you happen to be a motorbike rental company and you're offering a bigger bike to your customer in response to a certain situation. Maybe the customer is not in a good mood, or maybe the customer has been unhappy due to some past experience. You have the opportunity of modifying your behavior and offering that very customer something extra. Inability to do something can be exemplified by a situation in which you happen to be a courier or a courier service and customer insisting on the same day delivery and you expressing very convincingly your inability to do so because it is not really possible. It is not within your means to have that packet delivered the same day. So when you express your inability by convincingly telling the customer why you are not able to do so, customer ends up believing you, and that adds to your integrity as a provider. So the modifications, as you have seen, can be very beneficial from the company standpoint because you have the opportunity of convincing your customers about your inability of doing something or offering something extra, meaning extra facilitation. With the clarity on these two phases, we now get on to the third phase, which is post-purchase. Well, managing expectations take a very significant form during this phase because it is this phase where consumers compare what they've gotten with what they had expected before buying the service. And it is all about consumers seeing that the promise that was made by the company is really delivered. And therefore, we are at a juncture where we have to draw the distinction between satisfied customers and dissatisfied customers. Meaning, if customers think they have gotten what they had expected, there's no gap, or there's a minimal gap, and customers could have fulfilled the need, they have fulfilled their expectations, and therefore they have ended up as satisfied customers. However, if they have not been satisfied due to any given reasons, then certain modifications could have to be brought about here as well. Now, these modifications are not about the modifications of behavior right on the spot. These are the modifications within your standard operating procedures. If something has gone wrong while you were implementing those procedures, you've got to make corrections. That is one of the tools that you have at your disposal, because it has to be made a standard practice that you do not make any mistakes, and anything and everything which you are supposed to be doing as part of your script and the role that you are supposed to be playing has got to be played in a way that there are no mistakes and no lapses. The standard practice has to emerge as standard practice with no deviations whatsoever. There are other tools also in order to gauge that the promise delivered was exactly according to the expectations of the customer. And we can do that by two different ways. The one is that you get into some kind of a structured research immediately at the conclusion of the service. You must have noticed this practice undertaken by airlines and restaurants. These are two classical examples. During the in-flight service, you are handed over a questionnaire and you are supposed to be answering the multiple choice questions in relation to different dimensions of the service offered. And same is the case with restaurants. While you are done with your food, you are handed over a small questionnaire with the request that you may hand that over to the staff before you leave the restaurant. And again, that is about so many different dimensions of the food that was served and also the service that was offered. So people do have a way of evaluating their service which they offered on its technical merits and its functional merits. But make no mistake that there's got to be balance between technicality and functionality. So what providers can do is get into some kind of analysis at the end of the whole exercise and then bring about certain modifications in their standard operating procedures if they think those modifications need to be brought about. If those are not warranted, all is fine. The second tool is again, the market research program, which is kind of a follow-up program. It is not something which is done right at the end of the offering of the service. It is something which is undertaken a little later. And again, this marketing research program is undertaken by way of offering questionnaires to customers, trying to find out their responses to the service which they received. And again, that takes providers into the realm of carrying out very incisive kind of analyses just to conclude that they really were in a position to deliver the promise that they made. And again, keep in mind that promise has got to be very accurate, meaning no over-promising and no under-promising. Under-promising might work temporarily, but then you see it takes you into a zone which is a narrow zone, and it raises the benchmark of quality. And the next time when the customer walks into the facility, the customer walks with a higher level of expectation. There's nothing wrong with that as long as you really can get used to operating within that narrow zone and again come up to the expectations of your customers. So getting back to under-promising and over-promising, over-promising is something that has to be avoided because that really builds up false expectations. The whole exercise of going through these three phases is about making sure that you have satisfied customers, because satisfied customers are an invaluable asset of the company, because they are the ones who get themselves into repeated cycles of purchasing, and they are the ones who add to the revenues of the company, and they are the ones who let it be known in the marketplace that you happen to be a reliably consistent service, and that adds more customers to your base. And therefore, the satisfaction is extremely important. Now, after having understood what managing expectations is all about, let me show to you with the help of a presentation what we have talked so far over the last couple of lectures. You will see from this presentation that it basically happens to be an extension of what I talked in the previous lecture and also in the one before that. We are very familiar with the two models of consumer behavior, and it is those two models of consumer behavior that lead us to make certain modifications that may be required in order to make sure that we end up having satisfied customers. And do not lose sight of the fact, before we start making these modifications, we've got to make sure that the analysis and consideration of the first phase of the purchasing process is given due weight, because that is the one where you make very vital decisions about how to respond to expectations and how to come up with a communication campaign which keeps the level of expectations of your customers at a very realistic point, meaning no over-promising, no under-promising, no over-communication, no under-communication. So what I'm saying is, if you have given due consideration to the first phase, then the modifications that may be warranted are going to be less. If the case is otherwise, then you're going to have to come up with more modifications. But as long as you really can bring about the right modifications and you can manage them, you have managed your expectations. You have managed expectations of your customers in just about the realistic way. And once you've done that, you have satisfied customers. It is all about satisfaction, because satisfied customers are the customers that you want. And satisfied customers are the ones which you are going to retain. Conversely, if you have dissatisfied customers, you cannot retain them and you lose those customers to competition. So the basic objective is to bring about modifications so that you can manage expectations realistically, so that you can satisfy your customers and in turn retain those customers. If customer satisfaction is that important, then we've got to understand what satisfaction is all about. What is it that leads to customer satisfaction so that we can retain them? So therefore, customer satisfaction is going to be the topic of learning now. What are the elements of satisfaction which customers evaluate in order to be satisfied and in order to convince them that they have ended up as satisfied customers? We are going to look into those. Satisfaction basically is a consumer's fulfillment response. The meaning consumer responds positively if he thinks his expectations have been fulfilled, if he thinks he stands satisfied, if he thinks that the need with which he came to the facility to buy the service stands fulfilled. A satisfied customer is going to be, like I said, a loyal customer. And a loyal customer is the one who's going to get into the repeated purchasing cycle, the meaning he's the one who will be buying the service over and over again. So we have to understand what is it that customer evaluates in order to feel satisfied. During the repeated purchasing cycle, we are not to lose sight of the fact that level of expectation will change and some level of variability is going to creep into it on part of the customer. And that takes us back into the filling the gap and looking into the levels of expectations and so on and so forth. But back to the satisfaction, we have to look at all those elements that customer evaluates in order to feel satisfied. There are 5 different elements which customer really gives a lot of weight to. Number 1 is the product and service features. Number 2 is the emotions of the customer while he buys a particular service. Third is about attribution. And the fourth is about the influence of family members, colleagues and friends. And the fifth one is the perception of equity and fairness. So let me talk about all these one by one. Product and service features are something which really influence the satisfaction of the customer to a great extent. And therefore, it happens to be the most important element of satisfaction. The examples could be so many, but let me talk about 2 different situations. The one could be relating hospitals. When it comes to the features of a hospital, it could be the rooms, the neatness of wards, the operation theater, the overall hygienic conditions, the ability of doctors, and punctuality of support staff, and availability of the support staff at just one call, and also existence of a nice pharmacy. Now, these are so many different features which a consumer generally will look into in order to feel satisfied. Whether a particular consumer looks into all these dimensions is something we can debate, and I'm going to talk about that just in a moment. The second example could be that of a health club which carries the different features of having a nice location in the first place, and in the second place having diverse facilities, and in the third place having modern equipment which is up to the expectations of the customers. Not only that, a well-maintained equipment. So these are the kind of features which customers look into. Now, the question whether customers look into all the features at the same time or they look into just a few depends on a particular situation. It can vary from situation to situation, and therefore we can say that customers could generally have a tendency to bring about a trade-off between and among so many different features. These trade-offs could be pricing versus overall quality, versus ability of doctors, versus the friendliness of the support staff. So in other words, if pricing happens to be at a high level, it is going to be traded off with the quality which is being offered, and it is going to be traded off with the friendliness of the support staff. You're going to ignore the high level of pricing because you're getting other services which are up to your expectations, and maybe they exceed your expectations. This is just one example of making trade-offs among so many different features, because the point is that all the features are considered by and large, but there could be situations where all the features may not be considered, or situations where certain features could become predominant and outweigh others. And therefore, you make certain adjustments to the level of expectation that you have, and that also has its impact over the zone of tolerance and so on and so forth. And I think after having talked about those factors so much, you now are in a position to relate what I'm talking about with the predicted level of expectation and the zone of tolerance. The second element, which again is very important, is consumer emotions. Emotions play a great role when it comes to satisfaction or dissatisfaction. If a consumer happens to be in a good mood, he is probably going to feel satisfied if the service falls very well on its technical as well as functional merits. However, if a consumer happens to be in a bad mood, what is it that we can do? Well, that takes us back to the area of modifications. And it is here again that providers have got to bring about certain modifications in the behavior in order to make sure that they create feelings of pleasure, happiness, and elation in order to overcome the feelings of depression, despair, and disappointments. So if you really can make your customers happy only because they came into the facility with a bad mood, that you are a successful service provider and you have done a great service not only to the company but also to the customer. That is the one way of keeping your customer satisfied. And you will recall this is a luxury which service marketing people have to themselves and not the tangible marketing people to themselves. Because you happen to be, as service marketers, the advertising agents, the promoters of the service, and because of the live encounters that you have with your customers, you have the opportunity of bringing about modifications in response to so many different situations that may crop up from time to time. It is upon a service provider to be very apt and smart as to how to respond to that particular situation, also making sure that you offer something extra and adhere to the standard operating procedures. The third factor, which is the element of satisfaction to customers, is the attribution for success. When consumers are pleasantly surprised, they have a way of attributing that success to the reasons that caused that success. And same is the case when consumers are disappointed. Meaning, when there is a failure, consumers again have a way of attributing that failure to certain causes, and they look into that. We are here concerned with all those things which can give satisfaction to customers, and customers do really care about in terms of their evaluation of the service to feel satisfied. Let us take the example of an airline, which happens to be a small airline, not very well known. You are pleasantly surprised by the quality of service which is offered to you in flight. Since you were not expecting that, you're going to be extremely satisfied, and that is going to exceed your expectations. And that is something which really makes you sit on the far right of the x-axis of the expectations satisfaction grid, you will recall. However, the situation the next time around is going to be different, because the zone of tolerance will change. It will narrow down because the expectation of the customer next time is going to be higher. So it may not do the trick next time. You as a provider have to see to it that your service maintains consistency, and what you offered the customer the previous time is offered again the same time, the next time. So this is all about the attribution for success. The third element that we really have to look into is about feeling of fairness and equity. Customers do care about equity and fairness when it comes to the treatment which is given to them during the time they happen to be in the service scape. They do have a way of seeing that they're not being discriminated against others. Again, with the help of an example, I would try to explain this element. Just envision the ground staff of an airline insisting upon passengers to maintain a queue without any discrimination for the VIP kind of customers. And when customers realize that there is no discrimination between an ordinary passenger and VIP passenger, they feel satisfied. By the same token, if you happen to be a service provider who's offering a service package, you've got to see to it that the service package is not designed in a way that it may bring into question your integrity as a service provider. For example, in a motor garage, the serviceability is something which really is taken into consideration by customers in a very comprehensive way. The spare parts that you suggest should be replaced, the kind of service that you offer, and the nature of service that you render. If at the end of the offerings, the customer get a feeling that certain services as part of the package were not really warranted, that is going to raise customers' eyebrows, and he's going to question your integrity. So this is about honesty. Customers really care about their perceptions of equity and fairness. Equity is about same treatment given to all customers each time and every time. And fairness is about being honest in terms of pricing, in terms of promotions, in terms of offering these services packages, in terms of designing those services packages. The other element which they really care about is the influence of their friends, their colleagues, and their relatives. Now, if you have bought a software package for your office, and you as a professional manager do not seem to be too much satisfied by the performance of that package, whereas others are highly satisfied, you may be influenced by their perceptions, meaning the experience that they've had, and you might think to yourself that so many people cannot be wrong, and maybe there has been something wrong with my perception of the service, and therefore you get influenced by what others have experienced. So this is, again, a very important element, and you as the service providers have to see to it that majority of the customers who you deal with have to be satisfied. So in other words, satisfaction breeds satisfaction. If a certain segment of the customer base, meaning by and large predominant part of the segment, is satisfied, then chances are all are going to be satisfied because it is the majority that counts. We have seen all elements that really count toward customer satisfaction. Customer satisfaction is extremely important because we want to retain customers. And retention of customers, as you know very well, is less expensive than having new customers. This is not to say that we should not work for getting new customers, but we must work all the time in order to add to the customer base that we already have. But why is it more important is because it is less expensive and it breeds loyalty. When you have a loyal customer base who is basically a satisfied customer base, you bring in more customers. And that gets you into a cycle which recurs and which brings you more and more profitability. As a matter of fact, customer loyalty is something which is being debated as something of very high significance, and that is something which goes even beyond satisfaction. But what is it? I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But let me tell you that customer satisfaction is something which many developed countries have started looking at as a measure of economic prosperity. You'll be surprised to know that just like they have other indicators of economic performance by way of prices and pricing and production and productivity and GNP and per capita income in quantitative terms, customer satisfaction is something which these countries are evaluating in qualitative terms. And you know why? Because satisfied customers lead toward more economic activity. When you have satisfied customers within one industry, meaning if a country happens to be very strong in car manufacturing, for example, and that country has so many satisfied customers for different brands that are being manufactured in that particular country, you can well imagine the translation of that satisfaction into the volumes that they sell and the profitability that companies get into. So what they say is that there is a logical and a direct correlational relationship between economic prosperity and customer satisfaction. And in turn, there's a relationship between that prosperity and high stock values. When you have high stock values, it obviously means that the company is into high profitability situation, and that adds value to the company. And that takes us into the dynamics of financial management. So you can imagine as to how satisfaction leads to so many different good things which can happen to companies and then eventually to the countries. because of this relationship between profitability and satisfaction, experts could maintain in those countries, and which is applicable to, I would say, all countries of the world, that we as marketing people should work to go beyond satisfaction. So the meaning that customer satisfaction is not something that we should be complacent about. We should go beyond customer satisfaction, and that is customer loyalty. We must try to generate loyalty. It is loyalty which breeds more customers. And with that, I can say that the whole exercise is all about generating customers, satisfying customers, retaining customers, and then making them loyal to the service. Because it is loyalty which breeds more customers. And customer loyalty being so much important, I think we've got to understand that with the help of a graphical presentation, which is an extension, again, of the one that I talked about in the previous lecture. Let's take a look at this and see how we can really get into a situation that breeds customer loyalty. You will recall this relationship between expectations and satisfaction, and you also recall that this is a very probable kind of a model, meaning this is not absolute, because there are chances that if people come to you with very high expectations, there are chances that those people are going to be dissatisfied because they came with very high level of expectations. And you will also recall that the most optimal scenario that presents itself on this grid is the area earmarked within the solid red lines, because this is the area which signifies just about the optimal level of expectations and just about the optimal level of satisfaction. Well, about satisfaction, you can say, why shouldn't we move further right? Well, the answer is yes, you can. If you offer your customers a service which is so much a quality service that they are more satisfied than what you see here, then according to this model, the level of expectation in that particular situation was a little on the lower side. And therefore, it is not an optimal situation. It is not a very viable situation in quality terms, because you have a smaller customer base. You will recall that when people have low expectations, they come to you in a lower number. And when you have people coming into your company in lower numbers, the conversions will also be lower. Although in proportionate terms, the conversions are going to be higher if the case was otherwise, which you can recall very convincingly. All I'm saying is this is not a viable situation. The viable situation is the red area. But then the question which must pop up in our minds is, why shouldn't we go a little upwards on the y-axis in terms of having customers expect more from our company and then satisfy them more on the x-axis? If that is the situation, then we have to draw certain modifications to this model, because, like I said, this model is probable. And what is it that we can do in order to make sure that customers who come to our company with that the blue dotted line, meaning with a high level of expectation, and how to provide them with a corresponding level of satisfaction on the x-axis, meaning the yellow area, we've got to do a few things. And I will take you back to the pre-purchase phase while we manage expectations. And you know very well that we've got to operate in a narrow zone, and we've got to see to it that the level of prediction which sits at high point is fulfilled, and it is very close to the level of desirability. And when we can do that, the answer to the question, why can't we do it, is yes, we can do it. And how we can do that, let me show you that with the help of an extension of this presentation. As you can see from this slide, there is another corresponding area by way of a triangle which sits right above the one that we are used to. And this area represents loyalty. And I was talking about the blue area versus the yellow area on the previous diagram. If you take a very close look here, you will see that that area also is represented by solid red lines. Why? Because the grid of satisfaction has expanded. It has crossed over into the area of loyalty. The people are having a higher level of satisfaction, and they are having a higher level of satisfaction because you are in a position to come up to a higher level of predicted expectations, and you are offering them satisfaction which corresponds to that prediction. And that correspondence of those 2 points takes us into an area of satisfaction which can be marked as the loyalty area. I think with the illustration of this slide, we can be very clear about the relationship between expectations and satisfaction exceeding into the area of loyalty. All we should be clear about is that we as service providers have to stay ahead of competition, and the only way to stay ahead of competition is to be much above the minimum level of the adequate service and have to be close to the level of desirability, which is the optimal level of the service expectation. Well, if we can be higher than that, there is nothing stopping us. And I think, hypothetically, you can talk about why shouldn't we go further higher on this grid on the y-axis? Yes, we can. And if we are at the topmost point on the y-axis, the correspondence will be in the form of the highest point on the loyalty grid, meaning that we are at the highest point on the x-axis, and the loyalty that we are getting out of this scenario is the optimal loyalty or the highest loyalty, and that may be a situation which signifies the ideal level of service. I mean, wishes can also be fulfilled, but if that is the case, then maintaining all that is going to be the challenge for service providers. And you can well imagine the zone of tolerance will almost disappear, and every time you have to come up to the expectations which are more wishes and less expectations. And you also know that wishes can be very probable. Therefore, we've got to learn what exactly could be the optimal point of loyalty, and the lesson is that we've got to work in a way that we exceed the level of satisfaction into an area which brings loyalty on part of the customer, so that we can retain that customer and come up with a very convincing loyal customer base. Let me tell you, in the words of marketing experts, that the highly loyal customers are known as apostles. Apostles are the ones who are the champions of a certain cause, and they are the ones who talk about your service in a very positive way. They talk about your service in such a positive way that they end up as kind of ideological supporters of the product. And that is why you see so many friends and colleagues of yours talking in favor of the brands which they buy. As a matter of fact, they believe in those brands so much that they really like to influence you. And that is one of the elements that I was talking about in terms of satisfaction. Those people, I mean, those apostles talk so much in favor of those products that you end up getting influenced and put yourself into the same fold. So this is what brand loyalty or loyalty of customers can do to your service. However, we also have 2 more categories of customers. Underneath the apostles, we have people who are kind of indifferent. So we can say they are the customers who are not really satisfied, and at the same time, they're not really dissatisfied. So in other words, they are the people who are very vulnerable. They can be dissatisfied at any given point in time, and they also can be satisfied. And obviously, as marketing people and as providers, we've got to work for their falling into the fold of the satisfaction. And what is it that we should be doing about that? I think that we have gone through the managing of expectations in relation to 3 different phases of the purchasing process. Well, we've got to be right up to the expectations, because we've got to be realistic about our communication campaigns, because we've got to be very consistent, and we've got to modify our behavior while we encounter our customers, and we've got to bring about certain modifications while we are passing through the post-purchase phase, meaning when the customer has bought the service and we are in a process to find out whether the promise that we delivered was exactly according to the expectations with which he came to buy the service. So we are going to work more toward making these indifferent customers satisfied. And of course, we are not to work against that. It goes without saying. And then underneath that, we have a group of customers who marketing experts call terrorists. Not a good terminology though, but that's the way they are. Why? Because they talk vehemently against the service. They're so dissatisfied that the word of mouth that they carry is so negative that they really hurt your service. And you know very well that the negative word of mouth is much stronger than the positive word of mouth. And you also know that the chances of people talking against the service are much higher than chances on part of satisfied customers talking about the goodness of the service. And therefore, the impact, or meaning the compound impact of the negative word of mouth, is something that really can derail the company and drive the company into the ground in terms of financials and then in terms of everything. So we've got to understand the behavior of apostles, the indifferent customers, and the terrorists. Let me try to show that to you with the help of another illustration. As you can see from this slide, the green zone is the zone of affection, because this is a zone where satisfied and loyal, rather loyal, I would use the word loyal customers fall. Underneath that, we have this blue zone, which is a zone of indifference, and underneath that, we have the red zone, which is a zone of dissatisfaction. On the left-hand side, meaning on the y-axis, we see loyalty, and on the x-axis, we see satisfaction. Now, if you take a close look at satisfaction, you will see that you have dissatisfied customers, and then you have customers who are neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, and then you have highly satisfied customers. If you draw a line, which is not a straight line, from the coordinates where sit the terrorists, right up to the zone, or rather through the zone of indifference and affection, that you will see that you end up with having customers who are loyal and who are apostles. So obviously, we are working for apostles. That is the prime target and the objective of any service provider. The importance of this illustration is that we've got to work within the blue zone. And this is what I talked about before showing you this illustration. Because it is here that we have a chance of converting these indifferent customers into loyal customers. Now, these customers are the ones who are not highly satisfied, but then at the same time, they're not dissatisfied. So if they're not highly satisfied, or say they're not satisfied, because we've got to do something about that, and the measures that we should take are the ones that you already have learned. Once we have undertaken those measures, we have every chance to convert those customers into loyal customers, meaning satisfied customers, and spin them into that green zone, which is the zone of affection. Let me give you one example here. A huge multinational corporation carried out marketing research in order to see to what extent they had loyal customers versus those customers who were not really loyal to the company, meaning who really did not have a high chance of coming back to the company to buy their service. And you'll be amazed to know that the customers who were asked to rate the quality of the service on a scale of 1 to 5, meaning 5 standing for the best possible service and 1 the lowest possible service, meaning 5 for, from company standpoint, apostles, and 1 for the terrorists, the results company got were amazing. The number of customers who rated the company as 5 was pretty high. And the number of customers who rated the company as 4 was also quite very high. Now, let us confine ourselves to 5 and 4. If you go by the numbers, you think to yourself that 4 is not bad either. I mean, if 5 is the highest possible, 4 is not bad. But the same research unearthed through the company that people who rated the company as 5 were 6 times as more likely to come back and buy the service over and over again than those who had rated the company as 4. So just look at the phenomenal difference between rating 5 and rating 4. In terms of numericals, not much of a difference. Just 1 notch up, 4 to 5. But just look at the qualitative repercussions. just look at the customers who rated the company as 4 and then having a minimal chance of coming back to the company to buy that service again. So why shouldn't the providers work for those customers getting into the fold of those who rated the company as 5? So the companies get into the modification phase after the post-purchase in order to see what is it that they can do that those customers can become loyal customers. If there is still something lacking in the quality, that they should bring about those corrections. If there is something which happened because of the variability, because when those the customers bought the service, maybe the encounters were not as productive and not as effective while they were in the case of those who rated the service as 5. So this highlights not only the characteristic of the variability, this also takes us into the area of the customer gap, which is between what is delivered against what was expected. I mean, you know what is expected. You also have systems and procedures in place. You have beautiful staff, who can deliver the service, but there is something that went wrong during the encounter that made those people rate the service as 4 and not as 5. So these are the variables that we have educated ourselves about, and we should be looking into in terms of different linkages between and among all these variables in order to make sure that what is it that is going to work in order for these customers to get into the fold of those customers who are absolutely loyal to the company and who will rate the service next time as 5. That is where the challenge lies. And it is because of this particular factor that customer satisfaction, which leads to customer loyalty, has become an indicator of economic prosperity. And before that economic measure, it is something which is measured by developed countries, like I told you earlier, on a certain index which they have developed, because satisfaction and loyalty are two things which lead towards high value, meaning financial value, and give us high stock values, they give us profitability, and translate into so many good medical results. And therefore we must work for customer satisfaction and customer loyalty. All the variables that are there and present themselves as a bag of mixed tool, we have learned those, and we have to be in a position to match all those variables of the marketing mix with the resource capability that we have in light of the characteristics of services, and as those characteristics present themselves in relation to the models of consumer behavior that we have learned so far. So let me give you a quick summary of what we have learned during this lecture and the previous one, because there has been a very strong correlation between the two. I started talking about managing expectations, and I told you that it is extremely important that we view managing expectations in relation to the 3 phases of the purchasing process, because if we are very considerate while going through those 3 phases, there is no reason why we should not be in a position to manage those expectations. And I also told you that the first phase, which is the pre-purchase phase, is the most important from the standpoint that it is there that we as service providers have to establish in a very accurate way the exact level of expectation. And it is in that phase that we must not talk about things which we cannot deliver, meaning that we must not make promises that we cannot deliver. And it is during that phase that we have to work out all those strategies that will bring into our working a tremendous level of consistency, because consistency is something which breeds customer satisfaction and customer loyalty. And those are the 2 factors that I have just talked about in relation to economic prosperity of a nation, not just one company or one industry, but in relation to one nation. And then I talked about all those factors which are the ones influencing the satisfaction index of the customers, as to what are those factors that we must evaluate in order to arrive at the conclusion that these are the situations or scenarios that affect customer satisfaction, or in other words, the positive sides of all those factors which can work in favor of the service product so that we have satisfied customers. Now, having had a pretty clear understanding of customer satisfaction and loyalty, which basically stem from understanding what expectations are, we now will move on to the next topic of learning, which is about quality, because satisfaction basically is a function of quality. And just like we have tried to learn what are the elements that we must evaluate in order to understand customer satisfaction, we should look into all those elements which form quality, meaning those factors and elements which customers look at and evaluate in order to convince themselves that the service they are considering to buy is a quality service, or the service that they have bought is a quality service, to the point that they should remain stuck to the company and buy that service every time it is needed. And quality factor is the greatest challenge faced by the services marketing people, and therefore needs special attention. There are a couple of, rather, I would say very precisely, three factors that customers consider, and those are the ones that you already are aware of, and those could be spelled out as the outcome of the service, meaning the technical outcome. And of course, when customers look at the technical outcome, they also look into the functionality of the technical outcome. The second element that they consider is the physical evidence, and the third factor that they like to evaluate is the quality of interaction. These three factors are then further divided into so many different factors and so many different dimensions. And customers look at those factors and dimensions in a very contextual way, meaning they relate those factors to one particular context. How they do that, why they do that, is going to be the topic of learning in the next lecture. I thank you for your patience and look forward to talking with you in the next lecture. Allah Hafiz until then.